The Eccentric Epistle Caper, from the Lost Anthologies of Sherlock Holmes. Lost Anthologies of Sherlock Holmes refers to a series of hitherto unknown stories centered around the iconic detective Sherlock Holmes, which have just recently been discovered. These newly found narratives, which were previously absent from recognized collections, add to the existing wealth of Holmes's adventures and provide fresh insights into his world. The Eccentric Epistle Caper. Chapter 1. The Opulent Outcast. Baker Street was pleasantly quiet that morning, the sunshine filtering through the heavy drapes of the sitting room at 221B Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes sat idly in his chair, a violin nestled under his chin, while Dr. Watson was busy putting ink to paper, immortalizing their most recent case. Suddenly there was a brisk knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson, their landlady, answered it, returning moments later with a well-dressed postman. "For Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the postman announced, presenting a thick, elegant envelope, its seal a deep crimson. Holmes lowered his violin and thanked the man. Once the postman had left, Watson, his interest piqued, asked, "Who might that be from, Holmes?" Holmes inspected the envelope for a moment before breaking the seal and unfolding the letter. His eyes scanned the densely written lines, and a small, fascinated smile appeared on his face. "We seem to have attracted the attention of a new adversary, Watson," he said, his tone full of intrigue. "The author has signed himself as the Opulent Outcast." Upon reading the rest of the letter, Holmes chuckled lightly. The letter was indeed unusual, filled with flamboyant language, references to historical events, and riddles all tangled in a web of metaphors. Watson, perplexed, asked, "Holmes, you can't seriously make any sense of that, can you?" "Oh, Watson, have some faith," Holmes teased, already deep in thought. "This is not a meaningless jumble, but a challenge designed for me." After several minutes of silent contemplation, Holmes sprung up from his chair and began pacing the room, reciting parts of the letter aloud. "The Trident King's bountiful chest, the world beneath, the weeping goddess, these are all cleverly coded references," he explained. "It's clear our adversary has an interest in the sea, the emerald of Neptune's heart, a jewel belonging to the Montenegro family. It's reported to be of unparalleled beauty." Watson was still puzzled. "Why would he give you clues to his next crime, Holmes?" Holmes stopped pacing, a twinkle in his eye. "Why, for the thrill of the chase, of course. He has studied me, Watson. He knows that I cannot resist a good puzzle." Sure enough, the next day, the Neptune's heart was reported missing. An urgent message arrived from the royal family of Montenegro, pleading for Holmes to investigate. Following the clues from the letters, the pair traveled across Europe, navigating through an elaborate maze of cryptic messages. The opulent outcast, living up to his name, continued to elude them, his crimes growing increasingly bold, and his letters even more cunning. Holmes, however, was undeterred. The chase seemed to invigorate him, making his eyes shine with excitement. The game was afoot, and Sherlock Holmes was in his element. And so the hunt for the Neptune's heart began, Holmes and Watson against the enigmatic opulent outcast, an eccentric criminal who seemed to be always one step ahead. The game was indeed afoot. Chapter 2. The Game of Shadows. The flight to Montenegro was long but uneventful. Holmes spent the majority of it immersed in the labyrinthine letters of the opulent outcast. Watson, on the other hand, passed the time by studying a book on Montenegro's history and aristocracy. Upon their arrival, they were greeted by a representative of the royal family, Lord Vladimir. He was a dignified man, whose stern demeanor concealed a certain desperation. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for responding to our plea so promptly," he said, extending a firm handshake to both of them. "The emerald is not just a jewel to us, but a symbol of our national pride." "Rest assured, Lord Vladimir, we shall do our utmost to retrieve it," Holmes assured him. The trio then journeyed to the Montenegro Palace, a grand edifice that carried the weight of history in every stone. They were shown the room from which the Neptune's heart had vanished. It was a large, lavishly furnished room with a pedestal at the center, now conspicuously empty. Holmes circled the pedestal, His eyes narrowed in concentration. There was no forced entry, he mused aloud. Who had access to the jewel? Only members of the royal family and a handful of trusted staff, Lord Vladimir answered. But none of them would betray us. No assumptions. Lord Vladimir, Holmes chided lightly. The answer often lies where we least expect it. As the day wore on, Holmes delved into the investigation while Watson liaised with the local police, sharing their findings and gathering information. In the meantime, another letter arrived, bearing the flamboyant signature of the Opulent Outcast. The new letter, much like the previous ones, was a riddle wrapped in enigma, replete with allusions to mythology, astronomy, and music. Yet there was a subtle change in its tone. It was more teasing, more defiant, as though the outcast was thoroughly enjoying the game. "Holmes, surely this is madness," Watson declared, looking at the letter. "He's taunting us." Holmes, however, looked far from frustrated. Instead, there was a fire in his eyes, the raw excitement of the intellectual chase. "It's a game, Watson, a high-stakes game of shadows, and the prize is the Neptune's heart." Each cryptic letter, every veiled insult, and all the complex clues were mere pieces of a vast, elusive puzzle. A game designed by a mastermind criminal, an eccentric with an appetite for theatricality and a fondness for intelligence. As the day concluded, Holmes and Watson sat together in their temporary quarters, the letters from the Opulent Outcast spread out on the table before them. The thrill of the chase hung heavy in the air. The game of shadows had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Cryptic Clues. In the early morning, Holmes stood by the window, the letters from the Opulent Outcast spread out before him. His brow was furrowed deep in thought. "So, what's our plan?" Watson asked, sipping his cup of tea. "We continue to follow the breadcrumbs," Holmes replied, a hint of excitement in his voice. The new day brought new places to explore, guided by the cryptic clues left by their enigmatic foe. They started at the local library, where Holmes engrossed himself in books about Montenegro's history and mythology. A reference in one of the outcast's letters to the Swan's final song led them to an old opera house in the heart of the city, abandoned but still holding echoes of its past grandeur. Hours were spent there, Holmes meticulously examining every corner of the decrepit building. His efforts were rewarded when he found a scrap of paper hidden in the hollow of an old stage prop, bearing the same flamboyant handwriting. The day waned into evening, with Holmes and Watson sitting in a local tavern, nursing cups of coffee and going over the newly found clues. "His references to celestial bodies and mythology are growing more obscure," Watson commented, trying to make sense of the latest letter. What could Venus weeping under Orion's belt possibly mean? "Ah, Watson," Holmes replied, "the beauty of the riddles lies in their ambiguity." They returned to their lodging late, the moon high in the sky. As they prepared for bed, another letter arrived, the messenger a young boy who ran off as soon as Watson had taken the envelope. This new letter was shorter than its predecessors, yet it carried an ominous undertone. It spoke of time running out and of a final challenge that awaited them. "This doesn't bode well," Watson expressed, concern etching his features. "Indeed," Holmes agreed, his gaze fixed on the letter. "The endgame is near." And so, under the soft glow of the moonlight, they readied themselves for what was to come. The chase was nearing its end, the final pieces of the puzzle ready to fall into place. The Neptune's heart was close. They could feel it, and so was their enigmatic nemesis, the Opulent Outcast. With the dawn, the final challenge would begin. The game was reaching its climax, and Sherlock Holmes was ready to make his move. Chapter 4. The Endgame. The early rays of the dawn painted a beautiful picture over the Montenegro landscape. Holmes stood by the window, the letter from the previous night in his hands, his mind whirling with theories and connections. After a quick breakfast, Holmes and Watson hurried to meet with Lord Vladimir, carrying with them the letters and their new findings. "We're nearing the end of this chase, Lord Vladimir," Holmes said, laying out the letters on a large table. The day was spent deciphering the latest cryptic message. The reference to Venus weeping under Orion's belt had led Holmes to suspect an astronomy connection. Hours were spent correlating stars, mythology, and Montenegro's landmarks. By the late afternoon, Holmes had a revelation. Venus weeping under Orion's belt, it isn't a reference to stars but to art. It refers to a painting in the Royal Gallery, The Lament of Venus, painted by an artist named Orion Beltramo. In the Royal Gallery they found the painting, a beautiful depiction of Venus under a belt of stars, tears cascading down her face. Upon close inspection, Holmes found a small inscription at the corner, barely visible to the naked eye. It was a set of coordinates. The coordinates led them to an ancient sea cave, known in local legends as Neptune's lair. As they navigated the labyrinthine caves, they came upon a hollow carved into the rock wall, just the right size for the missing jewel. But the hollow was empty. "Holmes, could we be too late?" Watson asked, a note of concern in his voice. Just then, a rustle echoed through the cave. From the shadows emerged a figure, an elderly man with twinkling eyes and an eccentric air about him. "The Opulent Outcast, I presume?" Holmes asked, stepping forward. "In the flesh, Mr. Holmes," the man replied, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. He produced a small box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was the Neptune's heart, as beautiful and mesmerizing as the legends claimed. Holmes swiftly moved, catching the outcast off guard, disarming him of the box and securing the jewel. The local police, alerted by Watson, arrived just in time to apprehend the thief. "I must admit your riddles were most entertaining," Holmes said, watching as the police escorted the man away. Back at the palace, there was a grand celebration in honor of the jewel's return. Holmes and Watson, though hailed as heroes, declined the festivities. For them, the real joy had been the thrill of the chase. Later, in the quiet of their lodging, Watson turned to Holmes. "You were brilliant, Holmes. This was indeed an intriguing case." Holmes, looking at the copy of the outcast's letters, smiled. "Indeed, Watson. And to think the game all started with a simple letter." The game was over. The Neptune's heart was back in its rightful place, and the opulent outcast was behind bars. But in the minds of Holmes and Watson, the echoes of the chase still lingered, a thrilling reminder of the adventure that was the Eccentric Epistle Caper.